The burned ship. The desert world was silent. Only the hot wind moving the dust. The sun a pale red circle above the broken land. A lone human walked across the cracked ground, his boots sinking into sand, his eyes searching the horizon. He had come here for salvage, nothing more. This planet was known for wrecks, for forgotten ships, for things left behind after war, but that day, he saw something different. In the distance, black smoke rose into the sky, thick and heavy. It was fresh, not the ash of old battles, but the breath of a new fire. The human stopped, his heart beating faster. His name was Daniel, a man who had traveled many systems, always alone, always careful. But smoke meant life, or death, and he could not ignore. That he walked closer, step by step, the heat of the ground burning through his boots. The smell reached him first. The bitter smell of burned metal mixed with something worse, something sharp that made his stomach twist. It was the smell of death. The ship came into view, or what was left of it. A transport vessel, not large, but torn open like an animal's carcass. Its wings were broken, one engine still spitting weak fire. Pieces of cargo scattered across the sand, boxes split open, cloth and metal shining under the cruel sun. Daniel slowed down, his hand on the old blaster at his side. He expected raiders, scavengers, maybe soldiers who had survived the crash. But the wreck was quiet. No movement, only the crackle of flames. He moved carefully, climbing over twisted metal, his eyes scanning every shadow. The silence was too deep, too heavy, and it made him uneasy. He knew this place could be a trap. Many hunters used burned ships to lure fools. Then he heard it, a sound so small he thought at first it was only the wind. But no, it was a cry, thin and weak, almost lost in the smoke. Daniel froze, his breath held, his eyes searched the wreckage until he saw it. Movement. A figure, near the broken hull, half hidden under bent steel, lay someone. A woman, her skin pale gray, her body covered in dust and blood. Her clothes were torn, and she clutched something to her chest. Daniel stepped closer, slowly, careful, not to scare her. The woman lifted her head, her eyes met his. Large, alien, shining with pain and fear. She was not human. She was one of the desert-born species, the Xyla, a race known for their fragile beauty and sad songs. She was breathing hard, every breath like a fight, but still her arms held tight around the small bundle she carried. The bundle moved, and then Daniel saw it. A baby, tiny, its skin the same pale gray as the mother, its cry soft but desperate. For a moment Daniel did not move. He had seen many things in his life, wars, markets, slavery, wrecks, but this struck him deeper. The woman was no soldier, no raider. She was only a widow, and that was her child. She tried to speak, her voice broken, words in her own tongue. Daniel could not understand, but he didn't need to. The way she looked at him, the way she clutched the baby, it was clear she was begging. Not with words, but with her eyes, begging for help, begging for life. Daniel's hand tightened on his blaster, not in anger, but in fear. He looked around quickly. His instincts screamed. If this ship had been attacked, the killers might still be near. Raiders always came back to check for survivors, to strip the dead. He thought about leaving. His mind whispered it would be safer. He had no reason to get involved, no reason to risk his life for strangers. But then the baby cried again, so soft, so weak, and the sound cut through his chest like a blade. He stepped closer, pushing away broken metal. His shadow fell over the woman and her child. She flinched at first, her arms curling tighter around the baby. But when Daniel crouched and slowly lowered his blaster to the ground, she relaxed just a little. Her lips trembled and she whispered a single word, quiet but clear. Please. Daniel didn't know her language, but he understood. The word was the same in every world. He reached out his hand, slow and careful. The woman looked at him, her eyes full of both fear and hope. Finally, with shaking arms, she let him touch the edge of the cloth around the baby. The child's small hand reached out, tiny fingers brushing his skin. Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years, a warmth inside, a pull. He had been alone for so long, but in that moment he knew. Walking away was impossible. He picked up the baby gently, supporting the fragile body. The mother gave a weak sob of relief. Her head fell back against the burned hull, her breath shallow. Daniel knew she was close to death, but not gone yet. Suddenly, a sharp sound echoed across the desert. Daniel's head snapped up. In the distance, figures moved, shadows on the sand. Raiders. Their shapes grew clearer with every step, weapons shining under the sun. Daniel's jaw tightened, his heart pounded. He had only seconds to choose: run and survive, or stay and protect this widow and her child. The baby whimpered in his arms. The mother looked at him with eyes that begged for more than mercy. They begged for a chance. Daniel rose to his feet, the baby against his chest. His other hand reached for the blaster. His decision was made. The desert wind roared and the burned ship stood silent behind him, but Daniel was no longer alone. Daniel stood with the baby in his arms, the desert wind biting against his face. Behind him, the burned ship still hissed with smoke. In front of him, shadows moved closer. The raiders. He glanced down at the alien widow. Her body was weak, her breaths shallow, yet her eyes never left him. They were not the eyes of a soldier. They were the eyes of someone who had already lost everything but still begged for one more chance. The baby squirmed in his arms, letting out a faint cry. The sound was small, but in the empty desert, it felt like thunder. Daniel knew the raiders had heard it too. Their pace quickened, dust rising around their boots. He crouched beside the woman, his voice low. "I can't fight with both of you like this," he muttered, knowing she could not understand him. Still, he spoke, as if the words themselves gave him courage. "But I can't leave you either." The woman's lips trembled. She tried to form words in her own language. The sounds were broken, weak like water dripping on stone. Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand you," he whispered, "but I know what you want." Her hand lifted slowly, trembling as she touched his arm. Her skin was cold, fragile, but her grip held a strange strength. She pressed her forehead forward just slightly, a gesture that spoke louder than words. It was not aggression, not fear. It was trust. Daniel felt a weight settle inside him, a silent plea that wrapped around his heart. The widow was not asking him to save her life. She was asking him to save her child's life. Her eyes said everything. "If I die, protect my baby." The raiders' voices carried over the wind now. Harsh laughter, metallic clinking of weapons. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run. But when the widow placed her child back into his arms, her weak body shaking, he knew running alone was no longer possible. He was bound to them now. "All right," Daniel said under his breath, his jaw tightened. "If it's a fight they want, then we'll give them a chase." He slipped the baby into a sling made from torn cloth, tying it close to his chest. The child's tiny heartbeat pressed against him. The widow tried to push herself up, her legs trembling like broken branches. Daniel caught her under the arm, half lifting her. "Come on, stay with me," he urged. They stumbled away from the wreckage, Daniel pulling her forward, step by step. The raiders shouted, louder, their boots crunching across the sand. Bullets or energy bolts cracked through the air, hitting the sand near their feet. The widow gasped, but did not scream. Her eyes stayed on her baby, every step for him. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't fight them here, not in the open. He needed cover, something to break the line of sight. The desert stretched wide, but ahead he saw rocky ridges, sharp cliffs like teeth against the horizon. If they could reach it, maybe they had a chance. He tightened his grip on the widow, pushing forward. The raiders were faster, trained hunters, but they didn't expect resistance. They thought this would be easy prey. One human, a dying alien, and a baby. Daniel proved them wrong. He turned suddenly, pulling his blaster free. A quick shot echoed across the desert. The bolt struck the ground near the raiders, scattering sand. The raiders ducked back, surprised. Daniel didn't wait. He fired again, hitting one's shoulder. The man fell with a scream. The others cursed, their formation breaking. Daniel dragged the widow forward, his voice rough. "We keep moving." Her breath was ragged, but her feet obeyed. Her eyes, though full of pain, burned with new fire. For the first time, she was not looking at the wreck behind them but at the horizon ahead. The child whimpered against Daniel's chest. His tiny hands clutching the fabric of Daniel's shirt, Daniel glanced down and spoke softly. "Don't worry, little one, I've got you." The sound of engines roared suddenly. Daniel's heart dropped. Raiders had speeders? 2 bikes appeared. Sand, flying as they sped toward them. Weapons mounted, sharp lights glowing. Daniel cursed under his breath. His blaster was strong, but not enough for speeders. He looked around desperately. Then his eyes caught a break. A narrow canyon mouth carved into the rocks not far ahead. If they could reach it, the bikes couldn't. "Follow." He pulled the widow tighter, shouting, "There, move!" She did not understand the words, but she followed the direction of his arm. They stumbled faster, their steps clumsy but desperate. The engines roared closer, shots fired past them, sparks jumping off stone. Daniel fired back, his aim sharp despite the weight on his chest and the woman on his arm. He managed to hit the front wheel of one bike. It spun wildly and crashed, flames bursting into the air. The other raider swerved, shouting curses, but Daniel and the widow reached the canyon's mouth, diving into its shadows. The bike tried to follow but slammed into the narrow walls, trapped outside. The raider fired, but the angle was too tight. Daniel pushed the widow deeper inside until the noise of the engine faded. They collapsed against the cool stone. Daniel, breathing hard, the baby pressed safely against him. The widow's chest rose and fell quickly, but her eyes were not only full of fear anymore, they held something new. Hope. She touched his arm again, weak but gentle, and whispered a word. The sound was almost like safe, but Daniel knew it was her language. Still, the meaning was clear. He looked at her and gave a short nod. "We're not safe yet," he said softly, "but I'll get you there." The widow closed her eyes, resting her head back, trusting him. The silent plea she had given was no longer silent. It was now a bond unspoken but stronger than any words. Daniel tightened his grip on his blaster, listening to the echoes outside the canyon. He knew the raiders would not give up, but he also knew one thing for certain. He could no longer walk away. The canyon air was cooler than the open desert, shadows falling across the stone walls. Daniel leaned against the rock, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. The alien widow sat close beside him, holding her child weakly but firmly. The baby's cries had quieted, small breaths, pressing against her skin. Outside, the raiders shouted to each other. Their voices echoed across the rocks, angry and sharp. The crash of the destroyed speeder still smoked in the distance. But more would come. Daniel knew raiders never stopped. Once they smelled prey, they hunted until nothing was left. He turned to the widow, his voice low. "We can't stay here," he said. His words were useless to her ears, but the tone carried the meaning. She looked back at him with tired eyes, then nodded faintly, as if she understood anyway. Daniel studied the canyon path ahead. Narrow, twisting, scattered with loose stones and fallen boulders. It would be hard to move quickly with her so weak and the baby in his arms. But the raiders wouldn't risk following on bikes in here. They would chase on foot, slower, angrier. "All right," Daniel muttered. He adjusted the sling so the baby stayed close against his chest. Then he slipped one arm around the widow's back, lifting her to her feet. Her weight pressed into him, her legs trembling. She whispered something, soft like a prayer. They moved deeper into the canyon, their steps crunching over gravel. Daniel's senses sharp with every sound. His ears caught the faint scrape of boots behind them. Yes, the raiders had already entered. Their hunt had begun again. The widow stumbled, nearly falling. Daniel tightened his hold. "Easy," he whispered. "Just a little further." He could feel her body weakening, every step a battle. Yet she forced herself forward, never letting go of the baby. The canyon twisted sharply, opening into a stretch of land filled with gray ash. It looked like a place where fire had swept through long ago. Black trees turned to skeletons, ashes falling like snow when the wind moved. The air smelled of old smoke, thick and bitter. Daniel felt the unease crawl across his skin. Perfect place for an ambush, he thought. His grip on the blaster tightened. He guided the widow across the ash field, their feet sinking into soft ground. every step leaving a trail that could be followed. A shout rang out behind them. A shot blasted against the stone wall, dust spraying. Into the air. The raiders were close now. Daniel spun, fired his blaster back. The bolt lit the ash like fire, scattering sparks. The raiders ducked, but more voices echoed. There were too many. Keep moving, Daniel urged. He pulled the widow forward, almost dragging her. Her breath came in sharp gasps, but she didn't resist. Her eyes stayed on her baby, determination shining through her pain. The ash stormed around them as the wind rose, turning the air into gray fog. Visibility dropped, shadows flickering in and out. Daniel used it to his advantage, firing blindly to force the raiders back, then ducking low to lead the widow between blackened trees. But the raiders were clever. They fanned out, their voices closing in from both sides. One figure appeared suddenly through the smoke, a blade in his hand. Daniel fired quick, the bolt hitting his chest. The man fell into the ash, silent forever. Another raider lunged from the left. Daniel swung his blaster, but the widow surprised him. With a weak cry, she grabbed a shard of metal from the ground and struck the raider's leg. He stumbled, and Daniel finished him with a shot. Daniel stared at her, shocked. She was barely standing, yet she still fought. Still protected her child. He gave a quick nod, respect flashing in his eyes. She met his gaze with the faintest smile, tired but fierce. The chase grew hotter, more shots tearing through the ash clouds. Sparks rained down, the smell of burning filling the air. Daniel's lungs burned as he pushed forward. His mind raced. He needed a way out, a path they couldn't follow. Then he saw it, a fissure in the ground, narrow but deep, a gap that split the ash field in two. The raiders wouldn't expect him to risk it, but maybe, just maybe, they could cross. He pointed. There. The widow didn't understand, but she trusted. He pulled her closer and ran. The fissure yawned wider as they approached, ash swirling into its dark depths. The sound of raiders closing in grew louder. Daniel leapt first, the baby tight against his chest. His boots hit the other side, sliding on the loose ash. He barely kept his balance. Then he turned, reaching out. The widow hesitated only a moment, then with what little strength she had, she jumped. Her foot slipped, her hand missing his for a heartbeat. Daniel's heart froze, but he lunged, catching her wrist, pulling with all his strength. Ash fell in sheets into the darkness below as he dragged her up. For a moment she lay against him, gasping. The baby let out a cry, but they were alive. The raiders stopped at the edge, shouting curses. Their leader fired across the gap, but the shots went wide. The canyon walls echoed with their rage, but they could not cross easily, not without ropes, not without time. Daniel pulled the widow up fully, holding her steady. We made it, he whispered. His voice was rough, but his chest swelled with fierce relief. The widow pressed her forehead lightly against his shoulder, her silent thank you clearer than any words. But Daniel knew this was not the end. The raiders would not stop. They would find another way around. They would keep hunting, and he would have to keep running. The ash still swirled around them, settling on his skin, gray like war paint. Daniel looked at the baby, then at the widow. His jaw tightened. I'll get you through this, he promised, even if they couldn't understand. And so the chase through ashes was not finished. It had only just begun. The fissure behind them faded into the gray haze, but Daniel knew it would not hold the raiders for long. He kept moving, guiding the widow forward, her weak steps leaving faint trails in the ash. The baby whimpered softly against his chest, reminding him with every breath that time was running out. The sky above darkened suddenly. A low rumble rolled across the desert. The widow looked up, her pale eyes widening. Daniel followed her gaze, and his stomach tightened. The horizon was boiling, an approaching sandstorm, vast and merciless. Daniel had seen storms like this before. They stripped flesh from bone, buried whole caravans. If they were caught in it, the raiders would not matter. Nothing would. Storms coming, he muttered, gripping his blaster tighter. He pointed toward the jagged canyon walls, searching desperately for an opening, a cave, anything to shield them. The wind began to howl, sand and ash swirling higher into the air. It clawed at his skin, stung his eyes. He pulled the widow close, half carrying her now. Her body was so light in his arm it frightened him, as if she might vanish with the storm itself. The raiders' voices grew faint behind them, swallowed by the roar of the desert. Daniel almost smiled grimly. The storm would scatter them too, but that meant little if he and the widow had no shelter. Then through the blinding veil of dust he saw it, a dark shape against the canyon wall, an opening narrow and jagged but deep enough. There, he hissed. He tightened his hold on her and pushed forward. The wind screamed in his ears, the storm rushing closer like a living beast. They stumbled inside, just as the wall of sand hit. The cave swallowed them in darkness, the roar of the storm, outside shaking the earth. Dust filled the entrance, but the stone walls held. Daniel lowered the widow to the ground gently. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. She was still alive, but the fight had drained her. The baby squirmed weakly, its tiny cries muffled against his chest. He set the child into her arms, watching as her fingers curled protectively, even in her weakness. Then Daniel pulled a small light from his pack, the beam cutting through the cave. The walls glistened faintly with minerals, water dripping from cracks. The air was cooler here, almost gentle compared to the storm's rage outside. Daniel sank against the wall, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his eyes never left the widow and her child. He thought of leaving again. He always thought of leaving. It was safer, easier, but something in the way the widow looked at the baby stopped him every time. It was love in its rawest form, a bond stronger than fear. After some time, the widow stirred. She turned her eyes toward him, her lips parted, and she whispered a word in her own tongue, soft but clear. Daniel couldn't understand, but the way she spoke it was gratitude. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You don't need words," he said. "I know." The baby let out a small cry. Daniel fumbled through his pack, pulling out a ration bar. It wasn't meant for children, but he broke it into tiny pieces, softening them with water. The widow watched carefully, then nodded faintly, allowing him to help. Together they fed the child, tiny bites at a time. The baby's cries softened, replaced by small, steady breaths. For the first time since the burned ship, Daniel felt a flicker of peace. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, listening to the storm outside pound against the canyon. But peace never lasted. His mind spun with questions. Who were these raiders? Why had they attacked the ship? Why did they chase so hard after a widow and her child? He looked at her again, her fragile form resting against the stone. Was there something more to her story? Or was cruelty itself the only reason? The widow shifted slightly, her eyes half open. She raised a trembling hand, pointing toward the sky outside the cave, then made a motion of fire falling. Her voice cracked, speaking in broken fragments. Daniel didn't understand the words, but he caught enough from her gestures. Her people had been attacked from the sky. Fire raining down, villages burning, survivors hunted. Daniel's jaw clenched. His heart hardened at the thought. He had seen too many wars, too many innocents caught in greed, and now here she was, cast aside, left for dead with her baby. And yet she still fought, still begged for life. The storm raged on hour after hour, but inside the cave something changed. The silence between Daniel and the widow grew softer, less heavy. A kind of fragile trust settled in, built not on words but on survival. At one point the widow reached out, her hand brushing his arm lightly. She spoke another word, short and hesitant. Then, slowly, she pointed at him, then at herself, then at the baby. Her meaning was clumsy but clear. Daniel's heart gave a small ache. She was naming them together, not strangers anymore, but something closer, a unit, a family in the making. He didn't answer, not with words, but he gave a small nod, and in the dim light, that was enough. The storm outside began to quiet. The roar turning into a low moan, sand drifted away, leaving only silence again. But Daniel knew silence was dangerous. The raiders would not have stopped. They would wait for the storm to pass and then continue the hunt. He rose to his feet, rechecking his blaster, his voice steady. "When this storm ends, we move." His eyes locked on the widow. I promise to keep you safe, and I will. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her head lowered slightly, and for the first time she whispered a single word Daniel did understand, clear in every language. Hope, she breathed. Daniel froze, his chest tight. Then, slowly, he gave a rare smile, small but real. Yeah, he whispered back. Hope. The storm had passed, leaving the desert in a strange silence. The sand outside the cave was piled high, covering old tracks hiding the path they had taken. For a short while, Daniel felt almost safe, but he knew better. Raiders did not forget. They would circle back, hunting until nothing remained. He checked his blaster, then glanced at the widow. She was awake now, cradling her baby close. Her body was weak, but her eyes seemed sharper in the dim light. Like a flame refusing to die, Daniel crouched near her, his voice low. We can't stay. We move as soon as you can walk. Of course, she did not understand his words, but she followed his tone. She gave a faint nod as if agreeing. The baby stirred. Letting out a small cry, the widow hushed him gently, rocking him against her chest. Then she looked up at Daniel, and for the first time she tried to speak more than a word. Her language was broken to his ears, soft syllables that made little sense. But she used her hands, her gestures painting the story her tongue could not. She pointed at herself, then to the baby, then drew a line across the sand with her finger, like something cut away. Her eyes grew wet as she mimed fire falling from the sky, ships descending, shadows blotting out the stars. Daniel's chest tightened. He had seen enough wars to know the meaning. An attack, a raid from above, villages destroyed, her people scattered. Like dust, he pictured it clearly. Homes burning, families running, soldiers hunting down survivors. She pressed her hand to her heart, then opened her fingers as if releasing something. Then she touched the baby's head, and finally she lowered her eyes. Daniel understood. Her husband was gone. Her family gone. Her people gone. Only she and the baby had survived. A widow, abandoned. In the ashes of war, Daniel felt his throat tighten. He leaned back against the cave wall, staring into the shadows. He had told himself long ago not to care, not to let the galaxy's pain touch him. It was easier to drift from place to place, to survive without ties, but here in this dark cave, her story cut through his armor. The widow continued, her voice trembling. She touched her arm, showing scars hidden beneath the torn cloth. Then she drew a circle on the ground with her finger and crossed it out. Daniel frowned, trying to piece it together, and then he realized her people had not only lost homes, they had lost their place in their own society. Widows were cast aside, seen as cursed, unwanted, their babies treated as burdens. Daniel had heard whispers of such traditions before, cruel customs that punished the weak instead of protecting them. His jaw clenched. His anger was not loud, not burning. It was cold, heavy, settled deep inside. He looked at her, at the way she clutched the child even as her body trembled, and he thought, they left you to die because you were a widow? The widow's eyes met his. She must have seen the anger in his face because she reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm, shaking her head slowly, as if telling him not to waste himself in rage. For a long moment, silence filled the cave, only the baby's soft breaths breaking it. Then Daniel spoke, even if she could not understand. I don't know why your people abandoned you, he said, his voice low but sharp. But I won't. Not me. Something shifted in her eyes. She did not understand the words, but she felt the weight behind them. Her lips parted, and she whispered, a word. Family. Daniel froze. The word was heavy. Her tongue struggled with it, but the sound was clear. A human word. A word that tied them together more than any promise. Before he could answer, the wind outside carried a new sound. Metal, striking stone, faint voices carried on the air. Raiders, their hunt had begun again. Daniel pushed to his feet, his hand tightening on the blaster. He glanced at the cave entrance, shadows moving just beyond the light. He had bought them time, but not safety. He turned back to the widow, his voice steady. They're coming. he said, even though she couldn't understand. She looked up at him, her body trembling. But instead of fear, there was something else in her gaze now. Trust. The baby whimpered. Daniel crouched and adjusted the sling across his chest, tying the child close again. He reached down, helping the widow stand. Her legs shook, but she clung to his arm. Her lips moved once more. Family, she whispered again. Stronger this time. Daniel gave a short nod, his eyes hard. Then I'll fight for family, he muttered. The storm outside had buried the old world, but shadows of the past still followed. Them raiders, cruel customs, endless war. Yet inside that cave, a new path had begun. One widow, one child, and one human who refused to walk away. When the first raider's shadow darkened the cave's mouth, Daniel raised his blaster. His voice was calm, steady. You picked the wrong family to hunt. The cave filled with tension, the widow clutching her baby, Daniel's finger on the trigger. The shadows of the past were close, but so was the fight for the future. The cave mouth glowed with faint light from the desert outside. The storm had passed, and now the hunters had returned. Daniel could hear their boots striking stone, their voices echoing as they closed in. He held his blaster steady, his body. Between the raiders and the widow, she sat in the shadow of the cave, her arms wrapped around the baby. Her face was pale, but her eyes did not leave him. Trust shone there, silent and unshaken. Daniel's heart thudded. He had faced raiders before, but never like this. He wasn't only fighting for his own life. Now 2 others depended on him. One too small to even walk, one too broken to even stand without help. The first raider appeared, his face painted with ash, rifle raised. Daniel fired first. The bolt lit the cave wall. The raider fell backward with a scream. More shouts rang out, shadows spilling forward. Daniel ducked behind a stone pillar, his mind racing. He couldn't win by standing still. They would swarm him, choke the cave with fire. He needed tricks, earth tricks, the kind these raiders would never expect. He scanned the cave quickly, eyes catching, loose stones dripping water, broken crates scattered from old miners. His mind began to weave a plan. He crouched low, whispering back toward the widow. Stay quiet. Don't move. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She clutched the baby tighter and nodded. The raiders moved inside, slow and careful, their weapons glowing in the dark. Daniel slipped a stone from the ground and tossed it into a side tunnel. The sound echoed like footsteps. The raiders spun toward it, firing blindly. There. Shots ricocheted. Sparks lighting the cave. Daniel moved in the opposite direction, his boots silent. He took one raider from the side, a quick strike with the butt of his blaster. The man fell, his weapon clattering. Before the others could react, Daniel grabbed the gun and fired into the air. The blast shook the cave ceiling. Rocks tumbled down, blocking part of the entrance. Dust filled the air, choking their vision. The raiders coughed and cursed. Daniel used the chaos, firing shot after shot. His aim was sharp. Each bolt hit true, dropping enemies before they even saw him. He was not faster, not stronger, but he was clever. He fought like a survivor. The widow watched from the shadows, her breath caught. She had seen warriors before, but not like this. This human was not trained by armies. He fought with desperation and wit. Each move meant to keep her child safe. One raider broke through the dust, charging straight toward her. His blade raised, the widow cried out, clutching the baby. But before the blade could fall, Daniel was there, tackling the man hard against the wall. The weapon clanged to the ground. Daniel's fist struck again and again until the raider stopped, moving. Daniel stood, chest heaving, sweat and dust covering his face. He turned, meeting the widow's terrified gaze. He gave a sharp nod, as if saying, "You're safe," and then spun back toward the fight. But the raiders were many, and he was only one. Shots sizzled past his head, burning holes in the stone. He ducked low, sliding behind a fallen boulder. His blaster hummed hot in his hand, power almost drained. He cursed under his breath. He couldn't keep this up, not forever. His eyes darted to the ceiling. Stalactites hung sharp and heavy, cracked from age. He aimed high, firing his last charged shot. The bolt split the stone, the ceiling roared, rocks collapsing, crashing down on the advancing raiders. Their screams filled the cave, their bodies trapped beneath rubble. Dust swallowed everything. Silence followed, broken only by the widow's quiet sobs and the baby's soft whimper. Daniel lowered the smoking blaster, his arms shaking. He had done it for now. The raiders were crushed, scattered, defeated. He staggered back to the widow, sinking to his knees beside her. She reached out, her hand trembling as it touched his arm. Her lips moved, whispering that same word again. Family. Daniel gave a weak laugh, bitter but warm at the same time. Yeah, he muttered. Family. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't over. Raiders never stopped. If these ones didn't return, others would. And the widow's past, her cursed place in her people's eyes, meant she could never go back. Daniel looked at her, at the baby, and then at the dark mouth of the cave. Beyond it lay the endless desert, dangers waiting in every shadow. But he felt something new stirring in his chest, something heavier than fear, stronger than loneliness. He wasn't running anymore. Not away from her, not away from this fight. If they wanted the widow and her child, they would have to go through him. And for the first time in years, Daniel welcomed the battle. The cave was quiet now, filled only with drifting dust and the faint crackle of broken stone. Daniel stood, with his blaster lowered, his chest heaving. His eyes scanned the wreckage, making sure no raider still breathed. The widow sat against the wall, her baby in her arms. She looked at him not as a stranger anymore, but as something more. Her lips trembled, but there was no fear now, only relief. Daniel stepped toward her, crouching low. It's over. He whispered, even if she couldn't understand. His voice was tired yet gentle. The baby gave a small cry, hungry again. Daniel smiled faintly, pulling a ration pack from his bag. He softened the food with water, breaking it into small pieces. The widow watched carefully, then nodded for him to continue. Together they fed the child, one piece at a time. For a moment in that dark cave, it didn't feel like war anymore. It felt like something else, something Daniel hadn't known in years. Peace. When the baby finally slept, the widow lifted her eyes. Her lips moved slowly, carefully, as if she was trying to shape a word not from her own tongue but from his. Her voice cracked, soft yet clear. Thank you. Daniel froze, his throat tight. She had learned his words, even in her weakness. He gave a small nod, his voice rough. You don't need to thank me, he said. We're in this together. She tilted her head, repeating another word. She had spoken before, stronger this time. Family. The word hit him harder than any bullet. For so long he had wandered alone, choosing empty skies over bonds. But now, with this widow and her child, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living for someone else. Still, the danger wasn't gone. Raiders would return, or worse. The desert was no place to raise a child. Daniel knew what he had to do. At dawn, when the storm clouds cleared, he helped the widow to her feet. The baby rested in a sling across his chest, small hands clutching his shirt. They stepped out of the cave together. The desert stretched wide, endless, but Daniel's eyes were fixed on the horizon. After hours of walking, the ground began to change. The endless sand gave way to scattered metal towers, lights flickering faintly in the distance. A human outpost, small but safe. The widow's eyes widened as she saw it. Her lips parted in awe. She whispered something in her own tongue, her voice soft with wonder. Daniel didn't understand the word, but he knew its meaning. Hope. As they approached, guards at the outpost gates raised their weapons, wary of strangers. But when they saw the human carrying a baby and guiding a weak alien woman, their stances softened. One guard called out, "You all right, traveler?" Daniel gave a short nod, his voice steady. "We need shelter." The guards exchanged looks, then opened the gates. Inside, people bustled, humans and aliens both, traders, workers, children playing. The widow clutched Daniel's arm, holding the baby close. Her eyes darted around nervously, but Daniel whispered softly, "It's all right." They were given water, food, and a small place to rest. The widow sat on a blanket, rocking her baby. For the first time, she didn't look like prey or a curse. She looked like a mother. Safe at last, Daniel sat beside her, leaning back against the wall. His body ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. That night, under the outpost's dim lights, the widow turned to him, her hand trembling. As she touched his chest, she whispered carefully, "Daniel." His name, spoken with effort. Her voice made it sound like something sacred. He looked at her, surprised. "You know my name?" She nodded faintly, pointing at him, then at herself, then at the baby. "Family," she whispered once more, her voice steady. Daniel swallowed hard, emotion tightening his chest. He reached out, brushing a strand of her dusty hair back, his voice low, almost broken. "Yeah, family." The baby stirred, opening tiny gray eyes. One small hand reached out, grabbing Daniel's finger with surprising strength. Daniel stared down, his breath caught. In that single touch, he felt it. The bond was real, unshakable. He wasn't alone anymore. The widow smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. And for the first time since he had found her beside the burned ship, Daniel allowed himself to smile too. The desert had tried to take everything. The raiders had tried to kill them. The galaxy itself had tried to break them apart, but they had survived together, and in that survival, a new family was born.